The people who broke into the Capitol are responsible for their actions. I'm not responsible. Trump's not responsible. If you think President Trump committed a crime, he can be prosecuted. Impeachment is a political exercise that will further divide the country and I think eventually destroy the presidency.
But you just said, Senator
Lindsey Graham there spouting off on some of the Republican rationales as to why they don't want to hold Donald Trump accountable for the Capitol Hill riot. In fact, 45 Republican senators just voted to squelch the Senate trial, saying it was unconstitutional since Trump no longer sits in office. So, with only 5 Republicans on your screen siding with Democrats, bear in mind 17 of them will have to flip to convict Trump, assuming every Democrat does as well. And since it looks like that's not going to happen, there is now a bipartisan push to censure Trump instead and use that resolution to bar him from ever holding office again. I want to bring in my guest here to discuss, Frank Bowman, a law professor at the University of Missouri. And Frank, would you have ever thought when you wrote your book, not once but twice, we'd be talking about, not theoretically but practically, this reality, and indeed even 2021, about impeachment?
it seemed a little unlikely, yeah.
Well, to that end, let's first put the constitutionality question to rest, or at least put it in to perspective. Most of the scholars I've heard say, yes, you can impeach a president even out of office. Particularly, they cited precedent, going back to Grant, if you will, here, and the defense secretary at the time, but also they cite the fact that Trump was impeached while being a sitting president. His trial happened after it, but at least he was impeached while still in his term.
Yes, I think, the argument that you can't conduct a trial now is, it's not utterly frivolous, unlike some arguments that have been advanced by the president's defenders last time, and I suppose maybe advanced again now. It's not completely mad, but I think the overwhelming weight of authority is the other way, for the reasons you cite. There certainly is precedent for holding a trial of an official after they've left office. But I think even more broadly than that, one has to consider the purposes that the framers had in mind when they adopted the impeachment remedy. They not only included a remedy for removal from office, but they included a remedy upon conviction of disqualification from ever serving again. And certainly when they did that, they were thinking, I think, about the kind of circumstance that we have now, a person who, even though he has left office by virtue of the end of his term in this case, nonetheless remains a threat to the democracy by virtue of the way in which he conducts himself. And I think we get a pretty good indication that he remains dangerous, not only by the fact that the Capitol still remains something of an armed camp, but unlike, for example, Richard Nixon, who after he resigned essentially went into the political wilderness and it was perfectly clear he would never return to plague us again, the same cannot be said of Mr. Trump, who remains the active center of at least a large faction of the Republican Party and who said he's going to run again in 2024.
For little civics, in terms of what was going on through the framers' mind, we often use that quote of Benjamin Franklin when with the founders he exited and people asked him, well, what do we have? And he said, a republic, if you can keep it. They clearly wanted to make sure, as you said, we didn't have the possibility of a demagogue. They created 3 co-equal branches of government. They made sure that we never had a king, obviously, here. They were afraid of this kind of thing, weren't they?
Certainly. You have to understand who they were. They were men of their time with the, with all the advantages and disadvantages that carries, but they were educated in a particular way, what we would call a classical education. They studied a great deal about the Romans and the Greeks. And before the framers, the people who wrote the Constitution, came to Philadelphia in 1787, a number of them made a very careful study of what we would now call political science, the political science of republics. And they concluded from their study, ancient and modern, of republics, that one of the greatest dangers to republics was somebody called a demagogue, someone who appealed not to reason, not through the ordinary instruments and processes of government, but appealed directly to the populace, appealing to their passions, their prejudices, and through that kind of appeal would set himself up first as a president and then potentially as a dictator. They were very much worried about that, and they wrote several provisions of the Constitution quite expressly to deal with that danger.
Do you think, in the founders' mind, that they envisioned as partisan a time? Because the threshold to get to 67, it was different even the age of Nixon than seemingly it is now, Professor, in that, is there any line that a party, in this case the Republicans, would be willing to cross, as I said, 17 of them, to say that, yes, that a conviction's warranted? Do you think we got to re-examine the threshold for a conviction or not?
Well, unfortunately, practically speaking, I think that's unlikely. I mean, amending the American Constitution, as you know, is darn near impossible. Certainly the fact that they set the conviction threshold at 2/3 of the Senate represents the principal practical obstacle to really using impeachment as a serious mechanism for presidential control. But I think we are in a different place now, and we plainly are in a place where at least one of the great American political parties is less interested in civic virtue, in republicanism in the broad sense, less interested in promoting national interest than they are in appealing to the particular emotional needs of their electoral base. That's a dangerous thing. It is quite clear that the Republicans in the legislature, House and Senate, certainly a majority of them, are unwilling to repudiate what Mr. Trump did. I heard before I got on here, I heard you had a quote from Lindsey Graham saying, well, it's not Mr. Trump's fault, it's not my fault. Rubbish. The insurrection on the 6th was certainly Trump's fault, but it's also Lindsey Graham's fault. It's the fault of every Republican in national office who, in the period between the election and January the 6th, failed to repudiate the big lie, failed to stand up and say, no, the election wasn't stolen. It was run quite well. And in fact, Joe Biden won and Donald Trump lost. And by their either active promotion of the lie that something else was true, or through their craven refusal to say anything at all, they bear great responsibility. In fact, I would say, in some sense, the people on the inside of the Capitol that day, many of them bore greater responsibility for the riot than the people on the outside, because the people on the outside were genuinely convinced, most of them, that some great steal of democracy had occurred, whereas the people on the inside knew better, but were too cowardly to say anything about it.
And as I said a little earlier, this program, possibly even more chillingly than all that, 3+ weeks later, it seems that those who pushed for that insurrection are almost being rewarded right now, rather than being condemned, at least on the political side. Professor, I really appreciate it. Again, the book, timely, unfortunately, still, High Crimes and Misdemeanors, A History of Impeachment for the Age of Trump. Professor Frank Bowman, thank you.
It's my pleasure.
All right. I find myself saying that a lot lately, but it has been a very long week. So when we come back, we're going to switch gears here, and we're going to pivot to the intersection of politics, but sports. The man on your screen, Curt Schilling, he had good enough numbers to make the Baseball Hall of Fame, most would agree, but once again, he has not been voted in, and it has nothing to do with steroids. It's his extremist politics that's like a reason keeping him out of Cooperstown. After the break, we'll debate whether or not that ought to matter.